chair. Okay, thanks. Sit. Sit. Hey, sit. Yeah, you're a good boy. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. I love you too. Sit. You're a good boy. Good boy. Good boy, sit. Good boy. Look at that. Traffic management. I love it. Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully that works.
Yep.
The microphone, you must be.
I'm about to talk. That's
Okay.
me. Oh, no,
Am I
I'm
right place?
Yeah, I'm a 10. That's
Okay.
me.
Okay.
Tony Jones. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Tony Jones, and this is the Path to the Uplands Stage. There's great stuff on this stage all day, so thanks for coming to this talk. Keep coming back, swing by here. You'll see a lot of really good stuff, and obviously there's all sorts of other stages too. I am the owner of Crosby. That's probably the most significant aspect about me that you want to know this morning. You can definitely pet Crosby after my talk. I'll be standing back there selling books. Crosby might want to sell you a book too. And actually every book, my wife made a little Crosby stamp. So I sign the book and then Crosby signs the book too. So that's pretty cute, right? There's just going to be some pictures up there as I speak. My wife's also a professional photographer, so I have a great benefit and blessing of having some great photos of my hunts. What I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so, and then hopefully have some conversation with you too, is about how to find places to hunt and people to hunt with. And I'll tell you a little bit of my story so that we can get into that and you can understand kind of where I'm coming from and how I ended up writing a book about my journey into hunting and kind of out of being a pastor. The tagline of the book is, "A pastor walks out of the church and into the woods." When I was a pastor, there was this big guy, Doug, who was a parishioner at the church. And I was a young pastor and didn't know much and had never hunted. And I think he must have seen something in me and asked if I wanted to go hunting with him, to go duck hunting with him. And I was like, yeah, how hard could that be? That sounds pretty fun. So we loaded up into his van and we drove up to Baudette, Minnesota. I really didn't know what I was getting into because after we got to Baudette, then we got into his 27-foot sport craft, drove way north into Canada in Lake of the Woods, and went on this little cabin on a slab of granite that had been in his family for a long time. And then the next morning, we got up at 4 a.m. and got in a duck boat and drove for an hour and a half to get to a wild rice bay where he hunted ducks. So we were deep in the woods, and this is maybe like 1999. Neither one of us, I think he had a bag phone. You know what I mean? Remember those? But he didn't take it with us on the duck hunt. He was like in the cabin. But nobody knew where we were. There was no GPS. And Doug, he navigated our whole thing in the dark, with a outboard motor, which he had another outboard motor hooked on the transom in case that outboard motor failed. It was like the backup outboard motor. And he navigated us to Simo Bay all by memory. Like I said, before GPS. So the point being, just start to get the impression of me having never hunted before and having really no idea where we were. I could not pull up Google Maps and locate myself. I did not have a Garmin InReach, nothing like that. I was really totally at his mercy. And Doug was kind of a crazy guy. kind of over-the-top character. And I don't know if any of you, I did not grow up hunting. My dad didn't hunt, my grandfathers did not hunt, so it was not part of my life. And Doug became, before we even used the term R3 or a hunting mentor, Doug mentored me in hunting. And it wasn't all good because Doug was a little bit over the top. He had these two black labs, Dallas and Dalton. Now I remember one day we were out there hunting and we took some shots at some ducks that were coming over and we missed, but Dallas, the bigger, this dog's head was the size of a county. He jumped, he jumped out of the boat. Doug was so mad, grabs this dog, like pulls this wet, dripping dog. Doug's looking around, grabs our coffee thermos and smashes it over the dog's head. I know, and you're like, it was one of those old plastic, with like the glass cylinder inside. It shatters over the dog's head. The dog is sitting there completely unfazed, just like with coffee dripping off of him and glass shards all over the bottom of the boat. And Doug's like realizes what a foolish act that was and says, there goes our morning coffee. And then another time we had pushed the duck boat up onto a bog and set up and put our decoys out and then pushed it up onto a bog, or he would run it up onto the bog with the outboard motor. And then we get, the hunting slows down. We've been out there a couple hours and it's time for us to get the boat off the bog. So I'm in the front of the boat, or I guess I was probably in the back, trying to push it off with a push pole, one of those duck foot push poles. And it was not budging. And I'm pushing and pushing, and then all of a sudden I hear splashing in the water behind me. Now, before I tell you what happens next, I just want to say, Doug is 6'6", 280, college football player back in the day. Maybe not in college football playing shape anymore, if you know what I mean. I turn around. Doug is completely naked. He's taken off all of his clothes and climbed out of the boat, and he's standing on the bog, thigh deep in muck, pushing the boat off the bog. The boat finally slides off the bog, and Doug kind of rolls himself into this duck boat, dripping wet, smelling like muck, nasty. So this is the guy who taught me how to hunt. Quite a character, but I was hooked. And I particularly got hooked on a night that we were driving home going home in the boat after a night hunt. It's not only dark out, but fog has settled and it's windy. So Lake of the Woods is a very shallow lake. It's basically, it's a dammed up swamp. And there are little rocks everywhere and there's, I don't know what, it's in my book, but there's something like 15,000 islands on Lake of the Woods. And, to the untrained eye, every single one looks the same. So Doug's navigating us home, but there's this deep, deep fog has settled in. And I'm sitting in the front of the boat. I'll never forget the experience. I'm on the floor of the boat. I've got one of his dogs on each side of me. I got my legs up over a bag of decoys, and I've got a car battery in between my legs because I'm holding a 1,000,000 candle watt spotlight. Remember those old things? And he would shout at me over the noise of the engine and the wind to shine it. He'd say 2 o'clock, and I'd flash but he didn't want me to leave it on because he'd lose his night vision, whatever night vision he had. So I would just flash the 1,000,000 candle watt spotlight at the shoreline so he could see that we weren't too close to the shore, but we couldn't get too far out into the water because there were huge breakers, and once in a while, a wave would come over the gunnel and I'd feel it splash on me and whatever. So it was a hairy experience. And then after a long time, he pulls into a back bay and cuts the engine. And he says, I'm lost. I don't know where we are. And we're low on gas. So at a certain point, if I can't figure out where we are, we're gonna have to pull up on an island and spend the night with the dogs huddled up. And when hopefully the fog clears in the morning, I can try to get a bearing and get us back to the cabin. He starts up the outboard and he pulls back out into the storm. And I have this very vivid memory of feeling at peace, strangely, oddly at peace, because I knew that I was completely in Doug's hands. There was nothing I could do. I was helpless in this situation. And here's what was an interesting dilemma for me, is I was a pastor, and I was preaching all the time about having peace in your life. But the truth is that in my own personal life, I had no peace. I was in a very terrible marriage situation that was killing me spiritually and taking a real toll on me physically. And so I was really struggling in life. But then I got out to this place where no one could touch me, where there was no cell phones, nobody even knew where I was. And I was in the middle of a literal storm, and I felt a great deal of peace, the kind of peace that I was supposedly, living out as a pastor. Well, that was just a little taste of me, of hunting, and it got me hooked. I was about 30, and then things happened in my life. I didn't get a chance to hunt, and my whole life fell apart between then and the time I turned 40. He did take me to South Dakota one time to hunt, and I shot my first wild rooster, and it was at a farm, walking some CRP. I'll never forget it. Maybe you remember your first wild rooster. We were in switchgrass, and I remember the bird got up between Doug and me, and it flew east behind us, and I spun around with, at the time, my Remington 870 pump, the F-150 of guns, and I swung and I shot and I dropped that bird, and it landed in a pasture on the other side of barbed wire. And I remember Doug's dog running and getting it, bringing it back to me, my first wild bird. Will never forget it. But then, like I say, things like circled the drain for me personally. And by the age of 40, I was getting divorced, I was in the middle of a custody fight, I was foreclosed on, and I had lost my ministry, because when all those other things happen, the church isn't always quite as welcoming as the church is supposed to be. Okay? But here's what I felt. I felt a call to be outdoors and to keep hunting. But I had no contacts. I didn't know anybody who hunted. And I will say this, the one time I did go out and hunt with these guys that Doug had introduced me to, he had quit hunting. He sent me out to hunt with these guys, and I made the worst mistake you can make when you're the new person in a hunting group. That weekend, I talked religion and politics. So this is like rule number one. When you're the new guy in a hunting crew, don't talk religion or politics. And I'll tell you that just a couple months ago, I got invited into a new crew in Iowa, and it was my first hunt ever with them. It was me and a couple guys my age in their 50s, and then some of our sons who knew each other through a rugby team. So we went and we hunted all day, and then the grandpa still lives in the little town in Iowa, and he owns this land. This is his farm. So we get done with the hunt, shot a couple birds. I shot a rabbit, and we're cooking up, and some guy brought venison. We're doing kind of a wild game dinner. NFL playoff game is on. So I'm sitting in the living room with the grandpa and some of the kids, and commercial comes on during the football game, and the grandpa starts to pull out his phone out of his pocket and says, "You gotta see and he wanted to show a meme about politics. And I was like, hey, all due respect, and thank you for letting us hunt your land today and be in your house tonight, but I just have this rule, no politics on hunting trips." And he was like, yeah, I get it, but you just gotta see. It's really funny, the latest meme about the politician, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, truly, for me, it's just this is a sacred thing. So let's keep that out. It's part of every other part of our lives. Let's just hunt and have fun. Let's talk about hunting and football or whatever. And so that was one of the things I learned, but it's part of, I think, a broader picture that I'm trying to paint of, for those of us who don't own land, but would like to hunt and love to hunt and find great. I personally find hunting became, for lack of a better term, the center of my spiritual life. It became my church, as it were. And so what I knew I needed to do was I needed to facilitate ways to hunt. I needed to insinuate myself into groups of people who hunted and who would have me along. Well, one of the things I did, where I started to join up with these guys who you've seen in the pictures, is back in the day, 15 years ago, before everybody was on Instagram or whatever, you may not remember this, you young bucks, there was a thing called blogging. Blogging, it's like the equivalent of owning an encyclopedia or something. It's so out of date now. But at the time, I wrote on my blog, I will preach for free in exchange for hunting. Because that's what I had to offer. I'm not mechanical. I couldn't come out and help a farmer fix his tractor. You know what I mean? I couldn't help a landowner do his taxes. I'm not any good at any of that stuff. What do? I'm a preacher. So I was like, well, I will preach at your church for free if you will find me some hunting. And a week later, I got an email from the Episcopal priest in Huron, South Dakota. And I knew nothing about Huron, South Dakota, except that it has the world's largest pheasant. And I was like, well, that's a good sign if it's got the world's largest pheasant. And she said, come on out, you can preach. And there's, half the people in my congregation are hunters. And here's the thing, here's like a little inside baseball in the church world, if you don't know like the differences. Maybe you've been to a church, like a charismatic church that has a 45-minute sermon or something like that. Episcopal churches, their sermons are like 12 minutes. So I was like, dang, 12 minutes of preaching for a weekend of pheasant hunting outside of Huron, South Dakota. That's a good deal for me. So I drove out there, and she introduced me to the guy who is now one of my dearest friends, who's driving down right now from Huron. He'll be walking around here this afternoon with me, Jorge Vicuña, the lone Chilean in Beetle County, South Dakota. Jorge. Married a Minnesota girl. They ended up in Huron. And he's a land manager who's as crazy or more crazy about pheasant hunting than I am. And so Jorge welcomed me in very graciously that first weekend at the recommendation of his pastor, Gene. And I hunted with Jorge, and I was so crazy about it that I called Jorge up a couple weeks later and said, I got 5 more days on my South Dakota license. Can I come back and hunt with you? Yeah, come on. So Jorge and I have been hunting together now 4 to 6 times per year for 15 years. And a lot of these other guys that have been in these pictures, some of whom are also driving out today from the Twin Cities, they became part of our crew too. So what I learned to do as somebody who does not have land but knows the value of land is I started to do whatever I could to make myself helpful to the landowners. So that's been, and this is where I want you to start thinking, because I'd love to hear from you before we're done about what ideas you have of how you've maybe made relationships either as a landowner or as somebody who doesn't have land and has access or knows landowners. Because one of the things, I hunt public land too, but one of the myths that I would like to debunk is the idea that, in South Dakota, you can only hunt private land if you are ready to pay $150 or $250 per gun per day. I've never paid for private land, and I hunt a lot of private land, and I've never paid money. But here's what I have done. I've developed relationships. I've become friends with landowners. I've driven out here in the spring with a chainsaw and walked through a shelter belt of Russian olive trees and cut walking lanes so that when we hunt, we can walk through with our dogs. I've planted hundreds of trees on private land. You know what I'm saying? I've helped landowners get connected up with Pheasants Forever staff and talked about how I arranged it so one day when we hunted around east of Huron, around Yale, South Dakota, we had a PF local staff member spend the whole day walking around with us and saying, I think you should do a prescribed burn on this land, and I think you should graze cattle over here because it'll take care of those thistles, and like this kind of thing. Because I've been try to be the middleman, again, as somebody who doesn't own land and never probably will have the finances to own a farmland in South Dakota, but I can still be helpful. Here's another example. With this crew one day, those of you who hunt have probably had a day like this. It's like one of those days I'll never forget. It was a December hunt. It was probably 5 below. It was nasty, snowing, brutal. And we got access. We were told, like, Jorge made a couple phone calls and said, oh, a woman who owns this land said we could go hunt this slough. Nobody's hunted it since opening weekend when her son hunted it. And she's like, go ahead, it's December. And this is another thing to remember, like in December, it's quite easy to get access. I mean, you don't go up to a farmer's door on opening weekend and say, hey, can I go hunt that slough? I just saw a bunch of birds in there. But you go there on like December 15th, and in my experience, more often than not, they're like, yeah, go ahead. Those darn pheasants are eating all my corn anyway. Go shoot them all, or whatever. So we go hunt this big slough that's like in a kind of a teardrop shape. And we have some guys blocking at the east end of the slough where it gets big into the teardrop, and the rest of us are walking. And Jorge always has us do this thing he calls the lazy line. So it's kind of the guys who are flanking are maybe 50 yards out front to get those birds that flare. But there were no birds flaring. We were just walking. No birds, no birds, no birds. And then we get to the end, and I remember I'm standing next to a guy named Roger, and we kind of put our gun, you rest your gun on your foot. We're kind of standing there like, well, no birds in this field, but I mean, good try or whatever. And we got this thing surrounded. And suddenly a rooster pops. Somebody shoots it. And then another one, somebody shoots it. 35 roosters got up out of that cattail slough. And they were like, they didn't all flush at once. They got up just one after the other. So everybody got shots, the dogs were happy. And it's one of those days, we took a picture, of course. I've got the picture on my phone of all of us in the snow and with all those birds in front of us. And as we were driving to the next farm or heading into Huron, we were probably heading into Huron to go to the prime time where we often eat dinner in Huron. Jorge just said something offhandedly like, I bet that lady who owns that farm would love some flowers or something. And I mean, that didn't slip past me. I collected money from the rest of the hunting crew, and I said, we're gonna send her a Christmas centerpiece to thank her. And sent it, and then I didn't hear anything back from her, but the next fall, back out in Huron with Jorge, he just says again, kind of offhandedly, like, she really appreciated those flowers. So it's doing those little things that I've found have become so helpful for me, and we've then, so when new hunters kind of come into our group, and you're probably in some groups like this if you hunt, where people kind of flow in and flow out of the group, but there's kind of a core. But when somebody new comes in, there's a few things we say. We're like, we're super safe. We're super safe. We unload our guns every time before we get back to the trucks, and we break them open, or we have a shell sticking out of out of our semi-auto so everybody can see that our guns are not in live fire mode. We all keep our dogs under control at all times, which again is easier said than done sometimes. But then we also say, and we're generous with the landowners. We take nothing for granted because we know what it means to own land out here. We know the amount of money it costs to farm it. We know that farming is an up and down affair, and we know that it's especially expensive to plant food plots, so Larry, who's going to be here later today, he'll send a text sometime in the middle of the winter and say, hey, I'm going to take half an acre out of cropland, and I'm going to plant a food plot for pheasants. Anybody who wants can chip in $100 for the seed, for the Pheasants Forever seed. And immediately, like, okay guys, everybody Venmo Larry $100 for the seed. Now, in the grand scheme of what it costs Larry to run, you know, I think he owns 6 farms in South Dakota. He collects $500. That's like spitting in the ocean, but it's the effort, right? It's like saying we care enough, and then when we come out there, or we'll come out, like I said, and we'll help him plant tree belts, or we'll weed around the tree belts that we planted 2 years ago and things like that. So we try to match their graciousness and hospitality